Welcome back. We're going to do part 2 of Simplicity 8912. Last week I used this pattern as an example for how to learn to read a pattern, how to cut it out, deciphering all the things that you need to know to start sewing and using a commercial pattern, and a lot of the things that can be a little confusing. So if you want to know how to cut this out, it's one video back. I will link it in the iCard here, and I will also link it down below in the description so you can find the cutting out information. But we're going to jump right into sewing. So the first thing we need to do before we sew is transfer all of our markings. So I'm going to take you over to the ironing board really quickly and show you how to do that. All right, we're going to transfer markings, and this is a step I would recommend not skipping, especially if you're a new sewist. Let me pick up my marking pencil here, and I have got the right side up on my pattern because that's how I cut it. I want to mark on the wrong side because that's the side we look at as a rule when we're sewing everything together. So I've stuck a pin through. I'm marking my circles here. So stuck a pin through on the size I am, which is a 20. And then I'm going to open up between the two so I can see the inside of both of them, and you can see the pin coming through. Take my pencil and I'm going to mark right where that pin is coming out. Just make a little mark for both of them so that when I'm done, I'm going to pull this out. I have a mark on each end, and that mark is where this circle is. And I'm going to do that everywhere there's a circle. So I'm going to do them at the top of the neckline, at the bottom of the neckline, at both darts, at my dart point, for my pockets, all of those places we're going to transfer markings. For the notches, I tend to, if I have 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I will do the cut-in method, which I showed on the sleeve last week. So see this little notch? I come in and I do a tiny little clip, make sure I get through both layers. I don't have to go as deep as the notch. I just want to mark where it's going to be, like that. And then I have a teeny tiny little cut that'll get taken care of in the seam allowance, but it makes it easy for me to find my notch. If it's a double notch, I'll do a little cut in the center of each of those little triangles. That's how I keep my markings so that I can tell whether it's a marking for a dart or a marking for a pocket, or if it's for a sleeve like this. I do clips and I do pencil. You can also do different colors. So like you could do yellow for notches if you want to mark the notch, and red for circles, whatever works out for you to make it easy for you to tell. Another thing I personally like to do when I sew, I do a lot of prep work. And one of the things I do is I go ahead and apply my interfacings. Now in the directions, they do interfacing application step 11. What I like to do though is have it already done because there's no sewing involved. You're just pressing on some interfacing. So when I'm at the ironing board and I'm transferring all my markings, I go ahead and fuse on my interfacings at the same time. So let me show you how to do that now, but it is step 11. If you want to wait, you can hit the timestamp and go back and forth, whatever makes it easier for you. But let me show you how to do interfacing. When I'm ready to fuse on my interfacing, this is the wrong side, here's the right side, and this is the nubby side. You can feel the little glue dots. This side is smooth, so you're going to put glue dots to wrong side. I use these silicone sheets because it's really easy if you're just off a little tiny bit to either glue some of your interfacing down to your ironing board or up to your iron. Either way, it's a mess and it leaves residue, and this silicone sheet does not allow that to happen. So I'm going to, in the camera this looks a little crazy. This is just a fold, but it almost looks like a double layer through the camera. So we're lining everything up carefully on the wrong side. Put down our silicone sheet. Now I have the interfacing down, so it's going to face this. If I was really concerned, I could put another silicone sheet on top. They come as a set of 3, or at least the ones that I buy. If you want them, they're in my Amazon shop. Oops, you don't need to steam. I just steamed on accident. And you're pressing, we're not ironing. So we're pushing straight down, giving it a little bit of weight underneath that iron. And can you see where it's glued on and where it's not? See the difference? And we're just going to give it a good press. If you have one of those nice steam presses that you can take the steam off, that's the whole big machine that you kind of pull all the way down, those are awesome. Someday I'm gonna get one. When I taught a million years ago at the Fabric Stash, we had one in our sewing studio where we taught classes, and it was the best. We also had a huge table that was all for ironing. Like, it was a huge table. The whole table was padded out for ironing. You could do whole big quilts on it. You could do giant skirts. So anyway, we're going to do that for all of our facing pieces. I'm going to peel that off, and this is what the other side is, and you can see it's not perfectly even. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to seam finish this edge and take off this excess anyway, but where it was hanging over, it would have stuck to the ironing board, but it didn't leave any residue anywhere because I used my silicone sheet. Okay, so now that we have prep work done, we've got our interfacing on, and we've got our markings made, we're ready to start sewing. Step one is the dart, and then after dart they have you stay stitch your necklines and any of your curvy spots. If you have a soft fabric, do stay stitch. A stay stitch is a longer stitch, usually around a 4, depending on your sewing machine, just a straight stitch, and you're going to do it right on the 5/8 inch or just inside 1/2 inch or so, and that just gives more stability, protects your garment from stretching and even fraying a little bit while you're manipulating it before you've completely sewn it. So we're going to do those things. Next is a pocket, which I'm not doing, so we're not going to even worry about pocket for me. If you want to do a pocket, go for it. I do not like a pocket on me, a breast pocket, because I'm a very busty girl already, and it kind of looks funky. It draws attention where I don't want it to draw, and often it looks like a little tiny island floating across a wide garment. So for me, not usually a thing I want to do unless it has really cool style, or if it's something that sort of blends away if you've matched everything up. Skipping the pocket. So let's do a dart. If you've never done a dart before, I have a whole video on it. I will link it up above and below. That's just dart basics. Find my markings. I'm going to put on my glasses. And then I'm going to find my markings. The dart's pretty easy to see because you have this lump on the side. I always put a pin in the bust point so I know where I want to stop. And then I'll pin together my 2 other markings that are the sides of my dart. If you have a hard time with the dart, if you have a hard time keeping it straight, because this is a pretty big, deep dart, you can draw on the wrong side from one marking to the next. Just follow along on that straight line if you want to. The only thing I'm having, I would say, with the fabric that I've chosen, which is from Hobby Lobby, is that because it has this woven in design, it's a little hard to make transfers on the wrong side if they're on that design. So we're just going to dart really quickly. Make sure if you did your stay stitching that you've put your stitching back to a normal stitch length. For me, that's like 2.75 to 3, depending on what I'm sewing. The smaller the stitch, usually it's a little more high fashion, but it is misery to rip it out. So you want a stitch that's long enough to hold your garment together and look good, but also you can rip it out. You really don't want to go above a 3 as a rule for garment construction as far as stitch length. Don't forget to backstitch. If you've never backstitched before, or if you're really new to sewing, you do not need to backstitch a lot. 2 to 3 stitches is all it takes. All right, and there's my dart. So we will press this in just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and get the other one in. All right, we're going to go press our darts, and you can tell from the back side, if I press up on my dart, I have all this hanging off the side, but if I press down, it blends in perfectly because they designed the dart to be pressed down, which makes sense. You want to press your dart, if it's a bust line dart, down. So here's the dart before I press it. Here's the dart after I press it. Pressing is just vital. Give it a good iron while you're sewing. It makes a huge difference. Okay, we have darts, and now we're ready to sew together our center front seam. We were sewing between our markings. There's a little marking if you look at number 5 where it shows how far to sew. If you're sewing the full length version, you're not sewing the entire length of the front. You're sewing below the neck right here, there's a little marking, and then down near the knee, there's another marking. That's how long, because it splits open in the front. If you're doing the shorter version like I am, you're going to sew from the marking at the neckline all the way down. However, we need to seam finish this whole thing. If you have a sewing machine with a zigzag and not an overlock machine, then I recommend sew that front seam, then pull the seam allowance aside and zigzag that edge all the way down so that you don't have any fraying issues. You can also bias bind that edge, you can turn under and stitch. There's lots of ways you can seam finish, but you want to seam finish it in some way. We're working with a woven fabric that will fray when you wash it. You don't want this coming apart in the wash. You don't want to be losing seam allowance in the wash. And you also don't want to be losing threads while wearing it because it's not seam finished. So you need to decide how you want to seam finish it. Do not, even though I know this is super popular, do not glue those edges. It does a couple things. One of them is it's stiff as all get out. It sticks to your body, your undergarments, and everything else, and it's just not the best way to seam finish. I know it's popular. I see people gluing their whole garments together, but if you really want to make beautiful, bespoke clothing for yourself, take a little extra time to do a true seam finish. Sew it together. Don't glue everything. I've seen the trend, and I'm appalled. Honestly, like, I get it if it's a costume you're going to wear it one time, but if you're making something that's really special, put your time and effort in it because it's worth it. You're spending the money on it, and it takes a lot of time to glue it. Might as well just sew it. Anyway, off my soapbox on gluing your whole garment together. So I'm going to seam finish my garment right now. Not every piece, but I'm going to take my front, and I'm going to start up here at the neckline, and I'm going to just serge along this edge. I'm not taking any fabric away. I'm just going right along the edge, and I'm going to serge the whole thing, both fronts, so I can sew that center front that they're showing on number 5. Number 6, they're doing the shoulder seams in the back. So while I'm sitting at the serger, I'm going to go ahead and serge the edge of the shoulder seam. I'm going to serge my side seam, and I'm going to serge my back. So I'm just going to sit here and serge and get all of these, or overlock, and get all of those edges finished off. You can also serge your garment together. If you do that, you lose the ability to do alterations because it takes away seam allowance, and seam allowance is where alterations can be made. And I like to keep my seam allowances. You also can't press anything open, and we do not want to do that in the center front. We need to press it open because we have facings going there, and everything has to get pressed open, not to one side or the other. So we're going to seam finish independently. At the sewing machine, however, if you do a zigzag along this edge, it actually changes your seam allowance a little bit. It tends to pull it in, not always, but it often does. And if you do that, it makes it a little harder to get an accurate seam finish or a seam allowance later. So I often recommend sewing the seam first and then doing the seam allowance finish because it gives you more accuracy if you're doing it all at the sewing machine. All right, off to serging. So I have seam finished on my shoulder, my center front, my center back, and my side seams. I have not done the neckline or the armscye or the hem yet because we want to catch those in a minute. So those are the areas that are seam finished. This is how my seam finish looks, and it will keep it from fraying. This does like to fray. I'll show you up here. The way it's woven just makes it fray a little bit, so I'm being extra cautious. We're now ready to sew our center front seam. We're going to start, I've lined up right on my dot, right sides together on the 5/8 inch line. We're going to sink our needle here, there we go. We're going to take a couple stitches and then back stitch those couple stitches. And then we're just going to sew on down, keeping both layers straight, right on the 5/8 inch line. And then when I come to a pin, I'm going to pull it out right before I get to it. I always pin perpendicular and not parallel. Causes less issues. You're less likely to hit it if you forget to pull it out. It also doesn't cause puckering and waving if you do it that way. You do only need a few pins to hold it together. We're going to sew all the way to the bottom and back stitch again. So this is how the seam looks from the inside, and from the right side of the garment, there's the seam, and it's ready to be pressed. I'm going to press it open just to where it starts there. So I'm not going to really worry about this back here because this is all going to get the facing sewn on, but I'm going to press this open below, and I'm going to go ahead and then do my shoulder seams and my center back and press those too. Okay, let me show you how to press open a seam if you've never done it before. Well, first I'm going to just gently steam along the seam. That embeds the threads and makes it nice and smooth, and you can go ahead and press out anything else. Then go ahead and open it up so we can, this is the wrong side, so I can see the seam here, and we're going to give it a little press on each side of the seam. Go each direction gently. You have to be careful if you, depending on your fabric, you can actually press hard enough that you will see your seam finish pressed into the garment and it'll show up. So we don't want that to happen. And we also don't want a little pleat at the seam. So we make sure to keep it nice and firm and tight. And we're going to just gently go over the seam, pressing it open. Now, if you press against it on each side first, that kind of helps it, because you can see I'm not really doing a lot to get it to go open. Right here it starts to curve, the garment does, so I'm going to go ahead and just open it up manually and then give it a little press. You can steam. I'm not pushing hard on this. I just want it to stay open and flat. I don't want to embed this edge so that you can't see where I pushed. If you push hard and press, you will see the edge of your seam on here, and we don't want to see that on the outside. So we're going to do that for the center front, the center back, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew my shoulder seams front to back together, right sides together, doing exactly the same thing, and we'll press those open also. So here is the seam pressed open, so you can see how that looks once pressed. It looks beautiful. This is the front of my garment, and of course we don't sew all the way to the neckline. We stop here, so that's where I stop pressing. I'm not pressing anything above where our little marking was and where I stopped sewing. So that's how it's going to look. You want to do the center back seam first and then do shoulder seams. It's just a little easier to sew it that way. Pin together my shoulder seams. This is the front of the garment. This is the back of the garment. Right sides together. We're pinned together, and we're going to just sew our 5/8 of an inch on each seam. Don't forget to back stitch. So before we start the facing, I'm going to just show you the garment all put together. Everything is pressed. I'm showing you from the wrong side. So it's put together. Side seams are open. Sleeve isn't done. If you have any of your facing that's hanging off in the shoulder seam area, go ahead and trim it down so it matches your fashion fabric. And then we're going to line up our shoulder seam of our facing together, right sides together. Put a pin in it. We're going to do that for both sides like this. Okay, and I usually just pin them all together. Now, if you are sewing with this and you're like, my interfacing's pulling away, my interfacing's always pulling off, I haven't even sewn it yet. The interfacing glues on really just to keep it in place until you sew it. And then once we've done this, we're actually going to seam finish all the way around this facing, and that's going to help hold the whole interfacing to the facing and keep it from coming apart too. So we're going to sew these two little seams, straight seams of our shoulders, 5/8 of an inch. right, now before we go any farther, on step 11 they show what they're doing is they're just turning up the edge of this and top stitching it. I am not going to do that. I'm going to serge all the way around the outer edge instead. It makes it flatter, you get less of a lump, so that's my personal choice. You could zigzag all the way around it. It looks nice and neat to turn under that edge and top stitch it. Turn it to the wrong side and top stitch it if you want to. I'm going to press open these little shoulder seams real quick, and then I'm going to serge around the outer edge of this whole thing. If your fabric frays a lot, go ahead and seam finish these little your little shoulder seams also, just to make sure you don't have any issues. I'm going to do some seam finishing for a few minutes here. So I just pulled up and just stitched just the seam allowance on the shoulder seams, giving it a haircut. Now I'm going to come down to this corner. Here's my thing, and I'm going to start serging right here, and I'm just going to serge all the way around, leaving these flat. So I'm going to cross those pressed open all the way around to the other point on the other end. I have it right side up. All right, now that we've done that, it shows us matching up. We have our little marking down here. It's in yellow on mine. And we're going to lay it on top of itself, and we're going to sew from that marking down, straight stitching. So I did not seam finish this edge here or the curved edge, because those are going to get sewn to the garment and turned to the inside, and that helps protect it from fraying because it's all turned to the inside. So we're just going to sew this little tiny spot at the bottom from the bottom edge up to our marking. Don't forget to back stitch 5/8 of an inch. So now it's sewn together. I'm going to give it a little haircut, trim off some of these excess threads. If you have a problem with your sewing machine, a lot of times it's because you left a thread long and it gets caught in the sewing machine when you're stitching across it, and it can bind it up and really cause sadness while sewing. So by trimming threads or giving it a haircut, is what I call it, as you go, that is one way to prevent you having one more little hiccup as you sew. So I'm going to now take my neckline. We're doing right sides together, so if you want to, you can actually flip this around to the right side of your garment. Set my right side up, and I'm going to put my neckline on here. So we have a shoulder seam on our neck facing, and we have a shoulder seam on our garment. So we're going to lay them right on top of each other and pin it. I'm going to do that for both shoulder seams. And remember, our back neck has been pressed open, so we're going to actually pin that too. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that our seams stay flat when we sew across them. So if you need to, pin them up, put them down good so they don't go anywhere. And we're going to pin this corner, our neckline edge. And there is a marking there to help us. We have a little circle on our pattern that we've transferred. So I'm going to hold this up so you can see what I've done. All right, so here's how it looks. We have right sides together. I've pinned my corners all the way around my neckline. We've matched up our shoulder seams. I have pinned open that center back seam so it doesn't go anywhere. It fits very nicely. If it's not, that's probably because you didn't stay stitch or you pulled hard on it. And then we're going to just pin down the front. They meet, if you look right here, they're going to meet right at that dot. So when we sew this, we're going to start at the dot and sew up, and then we'll come back and press this all open. But we won't be sewing across here. We're going to start at dot on each side. It should, if we sewed correctly and lined everything up, it should match perfectly. And then when we go to fold this to the inside, it'll just be all finished off and pretty. We have a few things to do before we fold to the inside, but that's what we're going to do. So let me show you the sewing machine. So here's my dot on the garment, and here's my dot on my facing, and they line right on top of each other, and that's where I'm going to sew. So you can see how I've pulled everything else out of the way. I'm going to bring this to the sewing machine. And I want to sink my needle. It's lined up at the 5/8 inch. I want to sink my needle right where let me see where I stopped stitching, foot control. Sink my needle, that's where I'm gonna start. So I'm gonna go, make sure everything's flat and we don't have any little buckles underneath. And take like 2 stitches, back stitch, and then we're just gonna sew all the way up to our corner. So the little marking, though I don't have it marked on my facing, is right at the 5/8. So you can see I have 5/8 inch markings here and here on my throat plate. So I can use that when I get to where they're lined up. So I have a 5/8 inch corner. I can sink my needle and turn. And we'll just keep sewing. And the goal is to keep everything flat, so as we sew, we'll sink our needle. If you sink the needle, it can't move, as you have to manipulate your fabric to keep it flat. And we want to keep this seam flat and pressed open. You don't want to accidentally sew it to one side or the other or crooked. So we're watching all of those things. We are sewing on a circle that's kind of enclosed, so you will have to stop and straighten everything out once in a while. Okay, I'm coming to the other corner of the top of my neckline. So we're going to get right on that 5/8 inch or right on our marking and sink our needle. Lift the foot and turn. And now I am sewing down to where I started, or where the other side is, so we just want to keep our seam allowance flat, and we're going to sew right up to where we stopped stitching before. You can see your stitching lines. Okay, we're coming down and finishing the neckline. You can see I've kind of got everything lined up on top of each other, and we're going to sew right up to that spot. Okay, now that we've done that, before we can flip it around, I am going to just check that it looks okay and I don't have a hole down here at the bottom. We have got to trim around this neckline because we have got the inner curve is narrower than our stitched curve, and it just won't turn and look nice. We're going to take our scissors, and the first thing I'm going to turn it so you can see the white side because it's easier on the camera to see. So here's my stitching lines. All right, time to trim this up. So we're going to cut off this corner right here. You want to get close to the stitching, but not through it. Make sure you're not catching anything else. Okay, and if you have to, sometimes you can get even closer. You might have to trim away a little more in here. And then for this curve, because this curve is smaller than this curve, it just won't turn and look nice. So we clip up to, but not through. Okay, and we're going to make a few clips. Make sure you don't clip through anything you don't mean to. You want to clip through all layers. You don't want to do this until you've checked and made sure you don't have any mistakes, bubbles, that your seam allowance is correct, all of that. And then we're going to make quite a few little clips. So when we clip, it makes it flexible so that it'll turn nicely. And we're going to go to this ironing board and press it, and turn it under and press it, and make it nice and neat. If it's super bulky, you may need to trim out one of your seam allowances a little narrower than the other. And remember to get close to your stitching, but don't clip your stitching. To, but not through. And I always leave 1/16 of an inch or so from my stitching line. All right, so now that I have all of these clips, and it opens up nicely, we can now turn it to the other side. So I'm going to put my finger in one of the corners, carefully poke it through. All of this is going to flip to the inside. So we're going to press all this in. If you don't iron it, it's just going to be wanting to flip itself back around. But this finishes our neckline. And you can also see if you have a spot that's not smooth or is binding, that's where you need to go in and make maybe another clip or two. So let's head over to the ironing board and press our neckline. All right, this is the inside of my garment. Here's the outside. I'm pushing my facing to the inside. I'm rolling it so I can just barely see a tiny bit of the right side of my garment on the wrong side, because we don't ever want our facing to peek through. We're making it as fitted and as straight as we can, and then we're just going to press all along the seam edge. Press. Now, I can tell you right here is pretty bulky because we have got seam allowance with seam allowance with seam allowance with seam allowance all on top of each other. So there's a lot of layers. So right here is a little bit bulky, and if you're finding that's an issue, you might come in and trim away one of these, and if it were me, I would be trimming this one right here. You don't trim it too far away, like take away 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch of this one here, and it'll make it it gives it grading. It makes it a little smoother and a little less bulky right there on the shoulder, so you may need to do that. Now, we don't have side seams, and because of that, you can open up the garment. So here's the back of my garment, here's the front of my garment, and you can see that facing from the wrong side really well, and it makes it a little easier to lay it flat and to give it a pressing. So this is the inside where I have pressed, and you can see how it all lines up on top of each other. It's laying nice and smooth, got a nice shape of the neckline. Now, we have to decide, how do we want to keep this facing down? We can do an understitching where we come in, we pull up the facing, and we stitch the facing to the seam allowance underneath. So we'll pull it this way, lay it under the sewing machine, and we'll stitch around this outer edge on the inside, and that holds the facing down, which is a great thing to do. You can top stitch where you will see it through all layers. I don't want to do that. I have this nice woven in design, and I don't want to top stitch through that any more than I have to, because I don't want to interrupt it. And then you can also, if it's laying great and you don't have any really issues with it, you can come and just tack your facing to your seam allowance, like at the shoulder seam here, at the center front, and at the center back. I personally am going to go ahead and edge stitch on the inside, understitch. I'm going to do the understitching, and then I'm also going to do the tacking. So I have double duty on this facing, and then my facing won't be trying to turn around and peek through. To understitch, once I've pressed it, I'm going to open this back up. Make sure the seam allowance of all layers are pressed towards the facing. And you don't have to get all the way down to the very edge, but you want to get pretty close. And I'm using my straight stitch foot. Okay, so I've trimmed away seam allowance on the facing side, not too close because this stuff frays, but close enough. And now I'm going to push this back up. So it just makes it a little less bulky right there. It takes away, it makes it kind of grayed down. Now that the edge stitching is done, this is on the inside, I'm going to come to these seams here. I'm going to pull it apart so I'm not stitching through the outside, and I'm going to tack it down. So I put a pin in it to hold it. You can see how I pinned through these layers, but I'm not stitching through the right side. This is all seam allowance here. So I'm going to just stick it underneath. You can zigzag or straight stitch this. And it's literally tack a couple stitches, back stitch it, and that's just going to hold the facing down and keep it from rolling out. Okay, so we have edge stitched and tacked at the back, at the center back, both shoulder seams, and at the front. You just want to make sure, I found another hair that needs trimmed. You just want to make sure everything's flat and smooth. Pin it and get it straight first so you don't get it twisted. And we're ready to move on to pockets. The first thing we're going to do is take our pocket pieces, and we're going to seam finish this straight edge, each one individually. So I'm just throwing mine under the serger and finishing it off. You can zigzag that edge if you want to, but we do need to seam finish it in some way. I've already seam finished my side seam on the garment, and they're getting ready to be sewn to each other. It's pocket time. We're going to take our pockets and we're going to line them up from our little markings on each side. And what I do is I put a pin in the top marking and I poke it through till it lines up with the one underneath, and then I know I'm ready to pin it on. Once we've done that, make sure they're right sides together so it'll look like this. You'll have the pocket kind of laying to the inside. We're going to straight stitch between these two markings. So we're going to start right here, back stitch, sew on the 5/8, and then back stitch. And we're going to do that 4 times. So on every corner, so this is the back of the garment, so we're going to have 2 ears. That's what I call these, 2 ears, because when we fold them out, they kind of look like ears sticking out. We're going to have 2 on the back and 2 on the front, and if we follow our markings, they're going to line up beautifully. So let's sew in those pockets. And I did seam finish here, but I didn't do it around because once I'm ready to put the pocket to pocket, that's when I want to do that seam finish. It makes it a little flatter and neater on the inside. All right, we're ready to put our side seams and pockets together. So we have matched up. This is on the wrong side. I know at first glance it kind of looks like the right side because it's such neat weaving, but this is what the right side looks like. This is the wrong side. We're going to pin, this is the underarm. We've got front to back, right sides together. So I've pinned until I get to the pocket, and I'm pulling my little pocket pieces. Here they are. I'm kind of pulling them out of the way, and I'm pinning up and getting as close as I can to where I stitched the pocket on. And then I pinned around the pocket, pulling the pocket away, pinning underneath the pocket on the other side seam, and pinning down. So we're going to sew this in 3 steps. We're going to sew the side seam pieces below and above the pocket independently, and then we're going to come back and sew around the pocket independently, and then we're going to seam finish around the pocket. I'm going to serge it, you can zigzag it, you can bias bind it, you get to choose. So I'm going to go ahead and just sew my 2 side seam pieces above and below. I mentioned it, but after I sewed my front and my back together, I went ahead and went across the hem with my serger. You don't have to do that step, but this stuff frays so badly, I'm seam finishing every chance I get. All right, we have done this. I completely forgot to do the understitching on the pocket. It's great to do. I just forgot. It helps your pocket keep from peeking through. So do that if you want to. If you've done like I have and already sewn the whole thing together, you can come back and do this. I'm not worried about it with my fabric, but if you want to, go ahead and go for it. So I've done all of this on one side. I'm going to go ahead and do the other, and then we're going to start on sleeve. I'm going to remind you that I did not do the full length sleeve with the tab. I cut mine off short, so I will show you how to set in the sleeve, but I'm not doing the whole tab information. The last step on the pocket, you can see how they cut away the seam allowance, press everything out, and stitch up so that you have a smooth pocket. I will just tell you, I never do this for 2 reasons. When you cut away your seam allowance like this, when you clip into it at the pocket area, it frays so much you end up with a hole in your side seam. You can come in and do some of this stitching without trimming away if you feel like you might have a little hole under your pocket or it's not stitched close enough. But I absolutely never do this. I have never been happy with how it turns out. Even if you zigzag over that little edge, it tends to fray through because pockets take so much stress. So I just don't do this step. It doesn't exist in the world of Stacy sewing. You can try it if you want to. Let me know if you have problems with it fraying out and with holes around your pocket. We're ready for sleeve. Again, I'm not doing all of the steps, but we are going to go ahead and before I even sew it together, I'm going to put in a little basting line in the cap. We have these little markings right here, and that's where our basting line is going to go. So I've set my machine to a 4, and I'm just going to stitch on the 5/8 inch line from marking to marking. Because I marked on the wrong side, you can stitch it over, you can flip it over and stitch it with the wrong side up. I like to stitch it this way because I like to pull my bobbin thread. The bobbin thread is usually the loose one, and this way the bobbin thread will be on the side I'll be working on, so you can put a pin there to know where to start and stop. It's okay if you sew a little beyond it. So we're going to just do that for both sleeves, and then we're going to go ahead and sew this underarm sleeve, this underarm seam. I serged my fabric. I finished off the edge on the underarm and on the hem in preparation for doing the sleeve. So you can do that too. If you want to, you can zigzag it, you can serge it, or you can wait and finish it afterwards. This seam, because it's straight, could be a bias bound seam. It could be a self-finished seam like a French seam or a mock French seam. And if you don't want to do a turn up once hem, if you want to turn it twice, you don't need to serge this hem because you can turn it 2 times and self-finish that also. Don't backstitch when putting in these basting lines. If you backstitch, you can't pull the thread to take out the ease. So I have got my little basting line in, and I have sewn together the underarm of both sleeves. I'm going to go press this open, and I'm going to go ahead and press up my hem and top stitch in my hem while the sleeve is independent, because it's just a lot easier. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the ironing board real quick. We're ready to pin in our sleeve. This is how the sleeve looks finished, my little short sleeve with my 1-inch hem. Very cute. I've got I just did 1 row of basting lines for easing. You can do 2 rows. This is a fitted sleeve. It's a set-in sleeve, so not super worried about it. It kind of depends on your fabric too. We're lining up our notches. So here's 2 notches to 2 notches in the back, 1 notch to 1 notch in the front. Start with your underarm seam and your side seam and line them up on top of each other perfectly. Open up those seams and pin them down so they stay in place. The shoulder seam will line up to the center dot on the sleeve, so we can get those lined up, and then we can start pinning around from the notches. Then we will start in the cap and start easing in any fullness that there might be. All right, so we have pinned from our markings all the way around, and then we've also pinned in at this shoulder, so you can see there's just a little bit of ease in here, and that ease is really on the outside, but we're going to just pull our little basting line just a tiny bit and move it around. There are no gathers, so we want to just move this in this bias area to make it flat and move in this ease. This ease is what makes the sleeve comfortable to wear, because the shoulder gets a lot of movement, and we need to fit the shape of the body in that area. So let me pull in a little bit of this. So everything's right sides together, seams are pressed open. This is the underarm, and I'm sewing at 5/8 of an inch. Make sure you're set back to a regular stitching if you were basting just a minute ago. Now that I'm around, I'm inspecting my sleeve. I'm just making sure I don't have any foldovers or gathers anywhere. It's nice and smooth and pretty. So I'm going to go ahead now and serge around the raw edge, and I will serge off some. Now everything else I've left the full amount of seam allowance. On the sleeve I'm not, because especially in the underarm, you don't want that full thing sticking up under your arm. It's just more comfortable if we get closer to our stitching line. So I'm going to serge off about 1/4 inch of this seam allowance. I'm going to have about a 3/8 instead of a 5/8 seam allowance, and it'll just be more comfortable, and it'll also finish off all of this fraying fabric. So if you're sewing at the sewing machine, you can trim it off first and then zigzag this edge really well, or you can bias bind it, but I would trim it down a little bit. I went ahead and trimmed a little bit. The serger has a knife that will trim away, but I've trimmed away where I want it to start so I can start right where I want it to. It just makes it neater. So I've trimmed away where I want to start. I'm going to put it under the foot. You can see I can get right where I want it to. And now as I sew, it's going to come along and I can start trimming away. Seam finish. I also will let it trim any hairs. Just be careful not to go too deep. You can see it's starting to cut away some of the excess seam allowance. I also still have the sleeve down. If you have a fabric like mine that's really frayed, you do not want to skip the seam finishing. Let's turn this around. I have to watch. There's long floating threads, and I catch my ring on them and create a snag on the inside. So I've not pressed it completely. The side seams need pressed and the sleeve seam needs pressed, but I have a dress. This is the back. Let's turn it around. There's the pretty neckline. So all that's left for me now, here's my pocket. Ooh, I do love a pocket. Is the hem. So you can, I have serged my hem, but you can, after pressing open the seam, you can fold up 1/4 of an inch and then fold up again. I put away my thing, but I think there's 1.25 inches for hem. Then you'd fold it up another inch, and you can either hand whip stitch it or machine stitch it. I'm going to machine stitch mine, but because I've serged that edge, I'm not going to roll it twice. I'm just going to fold up the hem the amount that I want. Because there's 1.25 inches, if you find you need a little length when you try it on, you can do a 5/8 inch seam or a 5/8 inch hem. Like, you can do a much shorter hem if you needed to. I'm going to fold mine up 1 inch or the 1.25 inch, and I'm going to just top stitch it. I'm going to press it in first. I'm going to make sure all my seam allowances are pressed open and happy. So I'm just going to pin in a hem and top stitch around, and it's done. So after that, we're going to go try it on. I'll show you how it looks on. You can always make a self belt. There is a view where they show making little thread belt loops on the side, and there is a marking for it. One of our little circles that we can mark is on the waist seam just for that. If you want to know how to do that thread loop, if you want to see an action shot of actually how to stitch that, I have a video on it. So I will link it now up above and down below if you want to do the little belt loops that are the thread made loops. You want to use a decorative thread, not regular sewing thread for that. It's explained in the video. Okay, let's get our hem in and try this on. Remember me saying this is a good time to try it on to see how it fits, and I didn't do it. I should have, because it's snug. It's fine on top. It's actually plenty roomy on top, but I always have issues with the hip, and even though it says it will fit my measurement, it really doesn't. It's always just snugger than I want, and it's true again. So I've let it out, which is why I keep my seam allowance and don't serge them off. I've let it out as far as it will go. 5 pounds would make a huge difference for this to fit a little better. I think I would also like to lengthen it maybe 1 more inch. It's just a tiny bit shorter than I'd like. However, if it weren't so tight, it'd be a little bit longer. So let me back up and show you what it looks like. I do think it's super cute. All right, so snug, 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 snug. Ignore the mic. I'm a little worried about mic issues, so I'm not messing with it at all. It fits great. It's easy to sew together. I like the directions. All of that is great. It's just a little snug in the hip for me. I want to remind you that I started with a 20 top and a 24 hip, and I increased that hip a little bit on top of the size 24. So I have allowed for my measurement. So this is definitely fairly fitted in the hip if you're a curvy girl or pear-shaped. I'm pretty hourglass, but definitely floor on bottom. So it would take just like if I had 2 more inches in the hip, it would not be so tight. It would not pull on the side seam. Also, this back here, because it kind of sits on a shelf, I always end up with that. Just it's kind of loose in the waist because I'm small there, and then big below it, and it creates a bubble. So definitely really like this pattern. I love the fabric. I just want to lose like 10 pounds so it fits, or I will have to just make another one and adjust for the measurements, because I've let this out as far as this one will go with what I've allowed. That is one of the things, if you're a new sewist and you have lots of fit issues, if the pattern comes with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can cut a bigger seam allowance and give yourself more room for adjusting. A 1 inch seam allowance is really helpful in a situation like this. All right, I threw it on the dress form because you can get a little better view of how it would look if it fit a little better. I can tape down the dress form and make her a little skinnier, and it fits a little better. So you can see how nice it looks. It's a very attractive pattern. Definitely still too big in the hip though if it puckers in the pocket even on the dress form. So for me, it needs more pattern alteration. See you next week for another fun video.